The Case of the Poisoned Inheritance, a Miss Marple mystery. Hi there, welcome back to Haunting Vales. Tonight's mystery begins with an inheritance, generous, unexpected, and quietly resented. When a wealthy relative passes away, the village speaks in hushed tones of fortunes gained and futures secured. But celebration turns swiftly to suspicion when illness follows the reading of the will, and what seemed like good fortune begins to look disturbingly deliberate. The family insists it is grief, stress, coincidence. Miss Marple, however, observes the subtleties others overlook, the glance exchanged at the solicitor's office, the tea poured by a steady hand, and the sudden urgency to settle affairs before questions can be asked. She understands that money may be inherited, but motives are often far more revealing. Because in St. Mary Mead, wealth can be as deadly as any weapon, especially when it comes with a taste of poison. Before we uncover who truly benefited from this inheritance, don't forget to subscribe for more haunting Miss Marple mysteries on Haunting Vales. Chapter 1: The Poisoned Inheritance. The first whisper of trouble arrived in St. Mary Mead on a windless afternoon, the sort of afternoon that presses gently against the windows and makes every secret feel heavier than it truly is. Andrew's voice should lower here, steady and measured, as he tells of the death of Mr. Alastair Harrowby, a man of wealth, pride, and careful habits. He was found in his study, seated upright in his high-backed chair, one hand resting near a half-finished cup of tea, his expression fixed in something that might have been surprise or perhaps the final realization of betrayal. There were no signs of struggle, no overturned furniture, no broken glass. Only silence, and the faint scent of bitter almonds that drifted like a guilty thought through the room. Alastair Harrowby had not been a kind man, but he had been a precise one. His fortune came from decades of stern investments, quiet acquisitions, and an unwavering belief that loyalty could be bought and controlled. He lived in Harrowby House with his widowed daughter Eleanor, his nephew Thomas, and his long-serving housekeeper Mrs. Dalrymple. There was also Dr. Simon Graves, a family friend who had been visiting for several days prior to the death, ostensibly to discuss Alastair's declining health. The reading of the will had been scheduled for the very next morning. Miss Marple, with her gentle knitting needles and sharper mind, did not at first seem an obvious figure in this storm of inheritance and death. Yet she had been invited to tea by Eleanor Harrowby only 2 days before the tragedy. Eleanor had been pale, distracted, and deeply anxious about her father's recent decision to amend his will. According to Eleanor, Alastair had quarreled bitterly with Thomas only a week prior, accusing him of reckless debts and dishonorable conduct. Thomas, red-faced and humiliated, had stormed from the study that evening. The household had not been the same since. Andrew's narration should pause slightly as he describes the moment of discovery. Mrs. Dalrymple had carried in the afternoon tea at precisely 4 o'clock. She had found the door closed, though not locked. Upon entering, she saw Mr. Harrowby sitting unnaturally still. She had assumed he was asleep until she placed the tray down and noticed the coldness in his hand. The doctor was summoned. Dr. Graves examined the body and declared that death had occurred perhaps an hour earlier. It was sudden, he said, possibly heart failure. But the cup of tea remained half full, and there was that faint, unmistakable scent. The authorities were called, and Inspector Bradley arrived before dusk. He was thorough, skeptical, and somewhat dismissive of village gossip. He questioned each member of the household. Eleanor admitted she had been in the garden at the time of death, pruning roses alone. Thomas claimed he had been riding into the village to meet a creditor. Mrs. Dalrymple insisted she had been in the kitchen preparing the tray. Dr. Graves stated calmly that he had been in the library reviewing medical journals. None had seen or heard anything unusual. It was Miss Marple who first suggested, with quiet firmness, that the tea itself must be examined. Poison, she said gently, was so often administered in the most ordinary of ways. The cup was taken for analysis. The results returned the following morning were unmistakable. Cyanide. A lethal dose. The revelation shifted everything. Heart failure became murder. Accident became intent. An inheritance became motive. Alastair Harrowby's will, read in the sombre drawing room under the watchful eyes of the household and Inspector Bradley, contained a final surprise. The majority of the estate, including Harrowby House and the substantial investments, was to be divided equally between Eleanor and Thomas. However, a codicil, signed only 3 days before his death, altered this arrangement. If either beneficiary were to predecease him or be implicated in criminal misconduct, their share would pass entirely to the other. Furthermore, a charitable trust would receive a significant portion should both heirs be deemed unworthy. Thomas's debts were real and pressing. Several letters discovered in his room revealed urgent demands for repayment. Eleanor, on the other hand, had been financially dependent on her father since her husband's death. Without her share, she would be left in a precarious position. Dr. Graves had no direct inheritance, but records showed he had recently proposed a private investment scheme to Alastair, one that had been firmly rejected. Mrs. Dalrymple, though seemingly loyal, had served the family for 30 years and had been quietly written into the will with a modest pension increase in the original draft, a clause that vanished in the new codicil. Andrew should allow a measured silence here, as the tension thickens. The poison had to be administered between the time the tea was prepared and the moment it was consumed. Only 4 people had access to that tray. Only 4 had something to gain or lose. Miss Marple observed not merely their words but their small habits. Thomas's restless pacing. Eleanor's trembling hands. Dr. Graves's composed detachment. Mrs. Dalrymple's rigid posture whenever the will was mentioned. She remarked to Inspector Bradley that inheritance, like illness, reveals the true constitution of a person. Some grow desperate. Others grow bold. The cup had been poured in the kitchen. Mrs. Dalrymple insisted she had not left it unattended. Yet a footman recalled that Thomas had entered the kitchen briefly that afternoon, claiming he needed water before his ride. Thomas admitted this but denied touching the tray. Eleanor confessed that she had sent a note to her father earlier that day, asking to speak with him privately about the will. The note was found in the study, unopened. As the evening fell and Harrowby House grew colder in its grief, Miss Marple sat quietly by the fire, knitting, listening to the creaks and murmurs of a house heavy with suspicion. She believed the motive lay not merely in money, but in fear. Someone had feared losing everything. Someone had acted swiftly, perhaps believing the new will would ruin them beyond repair. And in the stillness of that night, as Andrew's voice softens to a near whisper, the true nature of the poisoned inheritance began to take shape, not as a simple act of greed, but as a desperate calculation made under the shadow of exposure. Chapter 2: Secrets Beneath the Will. Morning light did little to ease the weight inside Harrowby House. Andrew should speak with deliberate clarity here, each word precise, as the investigation deepens and motives sharpen. Inspector Bradley had sealed the study and ordered a thorough search of the premises. Letters, financial ledgers, and personal correspondence were examined. It was in these papers that the first crack in the family's polished surface appeared. Thomas Harrowby's debts were not merely the result of reckless spending. They stemmed from a failed business venture involving speculative mining shares. What he had concealed from his uncle was more damning: he had forged Alastair's signature on a guarantor document. The forgery had not yet been discovered by authorities, but Thomas knew exposure was inevitable. If his uncle had learned of it before his death, the new codicil in the will could have been a deliberate safeguard to disinherit him. Eleanor's situation was no less strained. Private letters revealed that she had been corresponding secretly with Dr. Graves. Their relationship extended beyond polite friendship. They had discussed marriage, contingent upon Eleanor's financial independence. Alastair had opposed the match, viewing Graves as opportunistic. If Eleanor lost her inheritance, the marriage would be impossible. If Thomas were disqualified, Eleanor would inherit everything. Miss Marple considered this quietly. Motive, she believed, was often layered. Love could drive as fiercely as debt. Dr. Graves himself was not untouched by suspicion. His investment proposal to Alastair had been more than a suggestion. It was a high-risk scheme requiring significant capital. Rejection would not merely bruise his pride, it would dismantle his financial recovery plan. Records showed that Graves had recently suffered substantial losses. A generous marriage settlement with Eleanor would resolve his troubles neatly. Mrs. Dalrymple's role seemed at first the least likely. Yet she had overheard arguments, witnessed tensions, and stood to lose her improved pension under the new will. More troubling was her son, Arthur Dalrymple, who had once been employed by Alastair but dismissed for misconduct. Mrs. Dalrymple had pleaded for leniency and been refused. Resentment can ferment slowly, Miss Marple often said, but it does not evaporate. The chemical analysis confirmed that the cyanide had been introduced directly into the tea after it was poured. The sugar bowl tested clean. The teapot was uncontaminated. Only the cup bore traces. This meant the poison was added at the last possible moment. Andrew should pause here, allowing the implication to settle. Who had the opportunity? Mrs. Dalrymple carried the tray. Thomas entered the kitchen briefly. Eleanor's note suggested she intended to meet her father but never did. Dr. Graves claimed to have remained in the library, yet no one could confirm his presence there continuously. Miss Marple requested to see the study once more. She examined the desk, the placement of the cup, the angle of the chair. Something was slightly off. The cup's handle was positioned to the left. Alastair was right-hand. A small detail, but Miss Marple believed details were the skeleton keys to truth. She asked Mrs. Dalrymple whether she ever adjusted items in the study after serving tea. The housekeeper insisted she did not. She placed the tray and left immediately. Thomas, when questioned about his kitchen visit, admitted he had leaned briefly against the counter near the tray. He swore he had not touched it. Eleanor stated she had avoided the study entirely that afternoon, too anxious to face her father's temper. Dr. Graves maintained his composure, explaining that cyanide acts rapidly and that Alastair likely collapsed within seconds of drinking. Miss Marple then inquired about the codicil itself. Who had witnessed its signing? Dr. Graves had been present, along with the family solicitor, Mr. Penruth. The solicitor confirmed the document was legitimate and that Alastair had seemed resolute, though troubled. Troubled by what? It was Eleanor who finally broke. In a quiet confession to Miss Marple, she admitted that her father had discovered Thomas's forgery the night before his death. He had confronted Thomas in a private meeting. Eleanor had overheard raised voices. Her father had threatened to inform authorities unless Thomas repaid the debt immediately. The codicil, Eleanor believed, was designed to pressure Thomas into reform or risk total disinheritance. This revelation narrowed the focus sharply. Thomas faced exposure, prison, and ruin. If Alastair died before reporting the forgery, and if suspicion did not fall upon Thomas, he would inherit half the estate and escape disgrace. Yet Miss Marple was not satisfied. She sensed misdirection, as though the most obvious motive were placed deliberately in the foreground. She returned to the matter of the cup's position. If Alistair had been right-hand, why was the handle placed left? It suggested someone had adjusted it after his death. Someone had stood close enough to move it. Someone unafraid of proximity. Andrew's voice should slow here, thick with anticipation. Miss Marple asked Dr. Graves whether he had examined the body before Inspector Bradley arrived. He admitted he had, checking for signs of life. He claimed he had not disturbed anything unnecessarily. But a physician, aware of cyanide's scent and effect, would recognize poisoning instantly. If Graves had known before others suspected, he had time to manipulate small details. And if Eleanor inherited everything due to Thomas's exposure, and then married Graves, the fortune would effectively pass to him. Miss Marple saw the pattern forming. The poisoned inheritance was not merely about immediate gain. It was about redirecting the flow of wealth through marriage and disgrace. Yet proof was still required. Chapter 3: The Hand That Sweetened the Tea. The final revelation came not in a dramatic confrontation, but in a quiet afternoon gathering in the drawing room. Andrew should deliver this with steady authority, building intensity with careful pacing. Inspector Bradley, skeptical but attentive, allowed Miss Marple to present her conclusions before the assembled household. Miss Marple began with Thomas. His debts and forgery provided a powerful motive, she acknowledged. However, his temper was impulsive. Poisoning requires calculation, access, and composure. Moreover, witnesses in the village confirmed Thomas had indeed been seen riding toward the creditor's office shortly after 3 o'clock, earlier than the estimated time of death. He had opportunity in the kitchen, yes, but no confirmed presence near the study afterward. She turned to Mrs. Dalrymple. Long service breeds familiarity, but also invisibility. Yet there was no evidence she left the kitchen once the tray was prepared. More importantly, she had nothing to gain from Alistair's immediate death under the new will. Her pension increase had been removed. His survival might have allowed reconsideration. His death sealed her reduced position. Eleanor's motive was emotional and financial. If Thomas were exposed and disqualified, she would inherit everything. But Eleanor lacked knowledge of poisons and showed genuine shock at the chemical findings. Her anxiety before the death suggested fear of confrontation, not premeditated murder. Finally, Miss Marple addressed Dr. Graves. He had medical knowledge. He understood cyanide's rapid effect and distinctive scent. He had been present at the signing of the codicil and therefore knew precisely how inheritance would shift if Thomas were disgraced. By subtly encouraging Alistair to investigate Thomas's forgery, he ensured tension would escalate. If Alistair died before reporting it, suspicion would naturally fall upon Thomas, the desperate debtor with motive and access to the kitchen. But the crucial detail was the cup. Miss Marple explained that when Mrs. Dalrymple placed the tray, the cup handle would have been aligned to the right, as was customary for right-hand service. Only someone attending the body afterward could have repositioned it. Dr. Graves admitted examining the body. In doing so, he likely adjusted the cup unconsciously while confirming death. Yet why would that matter unless he had been close enough to ensure the poison was consumed? The answer lay in timing. Dr. Graves had visited the study shortly before the tea arrived, under the pretext of discussing medication. He could have applied a small amount of cyanide powder to the inner rim of the cup already on the desk, anticipating the fresh tea would dissolve it. When Mrs. Dalrymple brought the tray, she naturally used the cup already present rather than replacing it. Alistair drank, unaware. The poison acted swiftly. Graves, hearing no alarm, waited before entering to discover the death in a medical capacity. Inspector Bradley confirmed that a faint residue was found not only in the served cup but also along the rim of a second cup stored in the study cabinet. This suggested prior handling with contaminated fingers. Graves's final mistake was underestimating human habit. He had assumed suspicion would rest entirely on Thomas. Yet he had not accounted for Miss Marple's attention to small domestic details. A cup handle, slightly misplaced, revealed proximity. Proximity revealed opportunity. Opportunity, combined with motive, revealed guilt. When confronted, Dr. Graves's composure fractured. He confessed not in rage but in weary resignation. He had convinced himself that Eleanor's happiness justified the act. He believed Thomas's forgery would ruin the family name regardless. By removing Alastair before formal charges, he sought to redirect blame and secure the estate through marriage. It was, in his mind, a corrective act. But murder dressed as protection remains murder. Thomas's forgery would be handled legally, but it was not he who poisoned the inheritance. It was the man who intended to claim it indirectly, through calculated grief and strategic affection. As the authorities led Dr. Graves away, Harrowby House seemed to exhale, though relief was tempered by shame. Eleanor wept not only for her father but for her misplaced trust. Mrs. Dalrymple resumed her duties in subdued silence. Thomas faced the consequences of his actions, yet with the truth exposed, the estate would be settled lawfully. Miss Marple, returning to her knitting, remarked softly that inheritance often tests character more than poverty ever could. Andrew should allow a reflective pause here, letting the lesson settle in the listener's mind. Wealth magnifies intention. Fear accelerates folly. And small details, overlooked by many, speak loudly to those who truly observe. If you found yourself drawn into the tension of Harrowby House, if you felt the weight of suspicion and the quiet triumph of truth, then stay with us. Like this video, share your thoughts in the comments, and tell us who you suspected before the final reveal. Subscribe for more mysteries.